Once upon a time, in a faraway kingdom, there lived a beautiful young princess named Snow White. Her beauty was so extraordinary that it even surpassed that of her stepmother, the queen. The queen was a vain woman who owned a magical mirror. Every day, she would stand before the mirror and ask, "Mirror, mirror, on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" For many years, the mirror would answer, "You are the fairest, my queen." But as Snow White grew older, she blossomed into a young woman of incomparable beauty. One day, when the queen asked the mirror the usual question, the mirror replied, "You, my queen, are fair, it's true, but Snow White is 1,000 times fairer than you." Enraged by this, the queen's jealousy consumed her. She could not bear the thought that someone more beautiful than her existed. So she summoned her huntsman and ordered him to take Snow White into the forest and kill her. The huntsman, who was kind-hearted, could not bring himself to harm the innocent girl. He told Snow White of the queen's wicked plan and urged her to flee deep into the forest, where the queen could not find her. Snow White, frightened but grateful, ran as fast as she could until she was lost among the trees. After wandering for hours, she discovered a small cottage hidden deep in the forest. She knocked on the door, but no one answered. Feeling exhausted and hungry, Snow White entered the cottage and found 7 tiny beds, a small table set with food, and little belongings scattered around. Unbeknownst to Snow White, the cottage belonged to 7 dwarfs who worked in a nearby mine. Snow White made herself comfortable and fell asleep on one of the tiny beds. When the dwarfs returned home from their work, they were surprised to find a young girl in their cottage. After they heard her story, they welcomed her and agreed to protect her from the wicked queen. The dwarfs warned Snow White to be careful and told her to never open the door to anyone, especially not the queen, who might try to harm her. Snow White promised to heed their advice and stayed inside the cottage, safe and sound for a time. But the queen, when she discovered Snow White was still alive, grew even more furious. Using her magic, she disguised herself as an old peddler woman and fashioned a poisoned apple. She made her way to the cottage, where she knocked on the door. "Snow White, dear, I have a beautiful apple for you," the disguised queen called out sweetly. Snow White, who had been taught not to trust anyone, hesitated at first. But the queen seemed so kind and convincing, and the apple looked so tempting, that Snow White finally opened the door to take the fruit. The moment she bit into the apple, a deep sleep overcame her, and she collapsed onto the ground. When the dwarfs returned home and found Snow White lying lifeless, they were devastated. They tried everything to wake her, but nothing worked. Fearing that she was gone forever, they placed her in a glass coffin, where they could still gaze upon her beauty. Days passed, and a handsome prince who had heard of Snow White's beauty and kindness came to see her. Upon seeing her in the coffin, he was filled with sorrow and love. He kissed her, and to everyone's amazement, Snow White woke up. The spell was broken. It turned out that the kiss from the prince was all that was needed to break the queen's curse. Snow White opened her eyes, and the dwarfs rejoiced. The prince, who had fallen in love with Snow White, asked for her hand in marriage. Snow White happily agreed, and they were married in a grand ceremony. As for the evil queen, when she heard of Snow White's return, she became so enraged that she was punished for her wickedness, never to harm anyone again. Snow White and the prince lived happily ever after in the kingdom, surrounded by the love of their friends, the dwarfs, and the joy that filled their hearts.